Would you pray with me? Creator God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable to you, O Lord, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. Thank you, Mara. That was beautiful. Well, today's gospel lesson is a familiar one. It is the parable that we often call the Good Samaritan, and it has become an institutionalized part of our lives. Forgetting that Samaritans in Jesus' day were neither accepted nor considered good, we name our hospitals after them. We name churches after them. And when somebody does something altruistic, we call them a Good Samaritan. That wouldn't have been a compliment 2,000 years ago. The reality is that in Jesus' day, Samaritans were not at all considered good. Samaritans were an ethno-religious group within Judaism that was not considered compatible with Orthodox Judaism. In other words, the popular kids didn't like them. They practiced an older form of Judaism that dated back to the 8th century BC when Assyria invaded Israel in 722 BC. The ways they practiced religion changed out of necessity. A newer understanding of religious practice became dominant, but the Samaritans retained the old ways. By the time of Jesus, 700 years later, the Samaritans had dwindled down to a small, fringe, radical group of people living on the edges of society, practicing Judaism in their own way that conflicted with the majority, with the orthodoxy. They were considered improper, impure, and unclean. The parable that Jesus told today would have been off-putting, I'm sure it was off-putting, to the first people who heard it, the proper Jews of Jesus' community. The man who was accosted in the story was understood to be an upright and proper Jew. We know this because Jesus talks about him going from Jerusalem to Jericho. And by that distinction, we believe that Jesus was implying that the man had completed a pilgrimage to the temple, something an observant Jew was required to do once a year. It was on his way back from purification in the temple that this incident occurred. He was accosted and left for dead by robbers. They stripped him, they beat him, and they left him half dead. All of those descriptors are important to this story because those three things identified him as now being impure and unclean. The robbers took a man who had just been made ritually clean in the temple in the eyes of the Jewish people and made him unclean, untouchable. So when the priest and the Levite approached him on the road, what were they to do? According to Jewish law, they were not allowed to have contact with him since he was now ritually unclean. They were not allowed to minister to a naked and half-dead man because both of these conditions made him unclean. The proper thing for them to do, according to Jewish law, was to ignore him and keep on walking down the road. Let me emphasize that again. The priests and the Levites did nothing wrong. In fact, they did what they were supposed to do according to the law. And then came along this hated Samaritan. To this ritually pure, observant Jew on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, the idea of a Samaritan giving him aid would have been despicable. Yet here he was, naked and afraid, on the side of the road, half dead, and a Samaritan was ministering to him in his situation. This hated Samaritan bandaged him, put him on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and boarded him, paying for the room out of his own pocket. What's more, he contracted with the innkeeper for prolonged care, promising to pay the innkeeper again out of his own pocket. This hated Samaritan, this member of an ethno-religious group despised by proper Jews, was the vehicle for God's grace, returning this man to a ritually clean state of being. Well, Jesus told this parable in response to a question that was asked to him by somebody trying to justify themselves spiritually by rationalizing their conduct. It was a lawyer who asked this question of Jesus, someone who adhered strictly to the letter of the law. To this lawyer, the actions of the priest and the Levite were correct and legal. Jesus rocks this lawyer's world, blows his mind when he frames the actions of the Samaritan as preferable. He gives him a whole new outlook on faith, pitting faith against law. Well, there have been many sermons preached on this parable. In fact, I would venture to guess that this parable is probably the most popular parable to preach on. There have been artistic renderings of this story by Rembrandt, Van Gogh, and Amy Moreau, poems about this story by Lawson and Brainerd, and at least one musical composition written about this parable, Cantata Misericordiam. I hope I said that right. Written in 1963 by Benjamin Britten. This is arguably one of the most popular stories in the Bible. But one of the amazing aspects about the Bible is that every story we hear, no matter how many times we have heard it, is capable of teaching us something new, especially when we hold it with that newspaper in our hand, when we hold it in tension with current events in our world. New light and new wisdom is always breaking forth from God's holy word, no matter how many times we have heard it. Today, in light of the recent obstructions of justice by the sitting U.S. Supreme Court, especially the action of removing constitutional rights from all U.S. citizens by denying women the right to comprehensive reproductive health care, this parable takes on a whole new meaning, a whole new way of understanding it. It was clear in the majority writings of the justices that, like the lawyer in today's parable, they do not necessarily see people. They only see their legal interpretation. The U.S. Supreme Court, as well as the lawyer who asked Jesus the question in today's parable, failed to understand that laws are not just laws. They are factors that affect the lives of very real human beings. The lawyer in today's parable failed to see the person in favor of the law. And our infamous Supreme Court has done the same thing. Well, Jesus, when he confronted the lawyer in today's story, he lifted up the person. The person who is hurting is what matters, not legal impositions on the body of that person. If the law says that a person must be ignored in favor of legal precept, perhaps the neighborly thing to do is change that law. That is what the Samaritan did in today's story, and that is the behavior that Jesus advocated. When we forget to see the person being abused by our laws, we play the role of the priest and the Levite in today's story, or the role of the lawyer who tries to justify himself using rationalizations. By our current system of jurisprudence, it is legal to incarcerate a person for 25 years simply for the possession of marijuana, if it is their third strike. By our system of jurisprudence, murderers get less time than people who commit lesser crimes because of mandatory sentencing laws. By our current system of jurisprudence, black and brown people are abused by our legal system every day. And by our current system of jurisprudence, a woman who gets an abortion because she was raped, because her living situation is incompatible with raising a child, or because her life is endangered by an unviable pregnancy, faces the possibility of legal action up to and including imprisonment. All of these situations are spoken to in our parable this morning of the Good Samaritan as lacking in neighborliness and incompatible with God's kingdom. Were we to truly follow Jesus, as the name Christian implies, we would indict our current system of jurisprudence, including the assault on women by the Supreme Court, and work for reformation of our justice system. This is the wisdom that God is speaking today through this familiar parable, and this is our charge to keep. After seeing several of our Supreme Court justices play the role of robber in today's parable, leaving women in our country beaten and abused, we have to wonder how we can be a neighbor. How can we be that neighbor to those who are suffering? We have to wonder what our role can be in the face of these actions. And that is where personal discernment comes in. How can we, as upstanding U.S. citizens, stand for the beaten and abused as the Samaritan did in today's parable? How can we minister to those who have been beaten and abused by our U.S. Supreme Court, offering them healing and aid? Well, to paraphrase Pastor Dave Barnhart, it is easy to say that we love unborn children. They are an abstract concept. They never make demands of us. They are morally uncomplicated. Unlike the incarcerated, the addicted, or the chronically poor, they don't resent our condescension or complain that we are not politically correct. Unlike widows, they don't ask us to question patriarchy. Unlike orphans, they don't need money, education, or health care. Unlike aliens, they don't bring all that racial, cultural, and religious baggage that makes us uncomfortable. They allow us to feel good about ourselves without any work at creating or maintaining relationship. And when they are born, we can easily forget about them because they cease to be the unborn. We can love the unborn and advocate for them without substantially changing our own wealth, power, or privilege, without reimagining our society, without apologizing or making reparations to anyone. They are, in short, the perfect people to love if we want to claim we love Jesus, but we actually don't really like people. Because the unborn are not yet people, they are easily recipients of our love. But we really don't see them. If we did, we would provide comprehensive health care, shelter, and aid to the mothers. We don't see the unborn. We see them simply as an easy way to make ourselves feel better, using them as an unresponsive tool. The key to ministering to those who are going through these troubled times after the Supreme Court ruling is to see them. We don't see women who have been affected by this ruling because we are afraid to talk about it. We are afraid to get up on a Sunday morning and talk about abortion. We are afraid to talk about reproductive health care honestly and openly. But the reality is that 1 in 4 women has had an abortion. That means that somebody you love has probably had one. 60% of women who have had abortions are women who already have children. 80% of all abortions happen in the first 9 weeks of pregnancy, well before life is present. Only 9% of women who have had abortions are teenagers, and 35% are women who are over the age of 30. 64% of women who have abortions are either in college or are college graduates, and 58% of women who have abortions have never had one before. This is their first time. This is the person we are called to see. The person we are called to see is someone who's making one of the most difficult decisions of her life, a decision that is based on her medical prognosis, the medical prognosis of her baby, her situation in life, or other personal considerations that are really none of our business. The person we are called to see is a person making a decision that should be private, solely between her and her doctor. The person we are called to see is someone who is hurting and making a decision while bearing the traumas of her life. This is the person that old men in black robes fail to see as they make rulings against them. This is the person the priest and the Levite passed by on the other side. This is the person we are called to minister with in the days that are to come in our country until this unjust ruling is overturned. The way we minister to those who have been beaten and abused and left for dead on the side of the road is to see them. And one way to see them is through personal stories. So I'm going to tell you one. And I got Kim's permission to tell you this before I included it in my sermon. September 11th, 2001 was a tragic day for our entire country. September 12th, 2001 was a tragic day for us. That was the day our doctor told us that the baby Kim was carrying did not have a heartbeat. The baby we envisioned for our future, who would be 21 years old this year, did not have a heartbeat and would not be. Kim's doctor immediately scheduled a procedure to vacate the pregnancy, and it was done just a few days later. While the entire nation was grieving the losses of 9/11, we were grieving our own personal loss, the loss of the baby we were anticipating. It was a difficult time for both of us. But under current Missouri law, she would have had to have waited for her body to naturally vacate the pregnancy, carrying it for who knows how long. Sure, this probably would have happened within a few days, but why would any Supreme Court force a woman to carry a non-viable pregnancy longer than she has to? In my former life in the grocery business, I worked with a woman in a similar situation, but she was 6 months pregnant. She was showing significantly at that time, and because of religious pressure by her family, she decided not to get the procedure to evacuate the pregnancy, and that was her choice. But it was several weeks before her body took care of this naturally, and during that time, she had to endure people asking her, "When are you due? What's the gender of your baby? And what are you going to name it?" She made her choice not to have that procedure, but under current Missouri law today, it's questionable whether she would have had that choice. Now, in both of these instances, there was no fetal heartbeat, and logic would say that, sure, these would be allowed, even under current abortion bans. But according to several medical and legal experts, that's not for sure. Trigger laws in a state like Missouri do not take these factors into consideration, and if there was a fetal heartbeat at any point in the pregnancy, the prospect of a procedure is uncertain. Dr. Sarah Hartwick is the head of the OBGYN department at a hospital in Iowa, and she said, "There could be barriers and delays to getting a D&C that should not exist, but are now likely because of the Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe v. Wade. When doctors have to operate in a climate of fear, they are hindered in providing life-saving health care, the type they are bound to uphold. When patients are forced to endure unnecessary waiting periods while their doctors try to clarify whether the care they need is legal, the consequences can be dire." I heard a story a few weeks ago from one of my pastor friends who told me that both of his grandmothers, his maternal grandmother and his paternal grandmother, died because of complications from abortions before the 1973 Roe v. Wade ruling gave them some legislation. Their abortions were not regulated and performed in unsanctioned ways. Now, they both obviously had children already because my friend is here. These were his grandmothers. They both chose the procedure for reason. Now, this is before he knew them. This was when his parents were young. They both obviously had children already, but they both chose the procedure for reasons that, again, are none of our business, and they both died. These are the people we are called to see on the roadside this morning. The person who has left by the roadside, half dead, is our wives, our daughters, our mothers, our grandmothers. Is there anything to be learned today from the familiar parable? Well, it's that those who are hurting are yearning to be seen. So who is the good neighbor? The one who shows mercy. Let us go and do likewise. Amen. Please rise and let's join in our hymn.